Hello everyone, I hope you guys this weekend has been good. Today I have a new video on how to add a bust dart to a basic bodice block pattern. So basically when people normally draft bodice blocks that have a bust dart, they normally start off with they'll start from completely from scratch. They will draft an entirely different pattern. And sometimes that pattern has say a shoulder dart, and then they'll shift that dart over to the bust. Now, the way that I'm going to show you guys how to add this bust dart is a little bit different. So here I'm going to take just a normal bodice block pattern, and then I'm going to insert the bust dart by adjusting the waistline. Now, I used this method back in December to create my birthday dress, and I really liked how it turned out. It was much easier. You pretty much just have to make a couple adjustments and you are good to go. And as usual, I'm using pattern drafting paper. I'm using paper, scissors, marker, pen, and a tape measure. And then I'm also using all the same rulers that I used when drafting my basic bodice block. Now that's just to help me trace out the pattern a little bit better so I have smooth lines everywhere. In addition to all of the rulers that I use to trace my bodice block, I also use a tracing wheel. It just looks almost like a really small pizza wheel, as my nephew would call it, and it just has these little tiny spikes all around it, and I use that to trace all the way around my pattern. And it puts little tiny holes in the paper. And these tiny holes, though it doesn't really show up on camera very well, helps me draw out my lines. And so that's what I use in today's video. But as much as I love the tracing wheel, you do have to be careful that it will puncture holes into whatever surface you have down below, whether that's your table or whatever. So I would recommend putting a cutting mat underneath, which I didn't do because I don't have one, so I plan on buying one soon, but be aware. So as you can see, I have laid down my bodice block pattern that I've drafted in a previous video. I'll link it in the cards. So I just laid it down flat, and then I used a long yardstick ruler and I just drew a line. That way I could line up the center fold of my pattern to that line and then tape it down. If you just kind of tape your pattern to the edge of your paper, the paper underneath sometimes likes to shift on you. So I find that it's easier for me to tape my pattern directly onto my paper instead of just taping it onto the table. And as you can see, I'm using my tracing wheel and I'm using my yardstick ruler to help me, because if you don't be careful, your tracing wheel will actually just kind of shift to the side some. And so in order to keep my lines really straight, I'm using a heavy ruler because you don't want anything that would just easily slide on you. And I am tracing all of my lines except for my hip line. I'm going to have to, in order to add the bust dart is going to take in fabric from the side seam. So in order for our front bodice pattern to still match our back pattern, you're going to have to add length to your side seam. So I'm going to actually shift down where my hip line is. And so that's why I'm going to trace that later. And again, I know that you guys can't see all of those little tiny holes I put in my paper, but I can see them, and that's what I'm doing right now. It's just connecting those lines. And I started off with drawing everything with a pencil, and I know that can't really show up very well on camera, so I'm going back and I'm using a black marker so that you guys can see all the lines a little bit better. So I mentioned earlier that you're going to want to extend the side seam. Now, to figure out exactly how much you want to add to extend the side seam, you're going to have to measure the highest point of your shoulder all the way down to your waist. And then you're also going to need to measure the highest point of your shoulder down to your waist, both in the front and the back. And so what happens is your bust takes up more space, so the distance from the highest point of your shoulder to your waist, measuring from the front of your body versus the back, is always going to be different depending on how big your bust is. And so for me, that difference is 2 inches, and it could be different for you. But what I simply did was I took my grading ruler, which has a width of 2 inches, and I placed that directly below my waistline, and then I drew a line. Now, because that's going to be my new waistline, I now am going to go back and trace my hip portion of my pattern. So I placed the line, my waistline from my previous pattern, onto my new waistline on my new pattern, and then now I'm drawing in my hip line. Okay, so in a second, I'm gonna actually take my old pattern and place it back onto my paper, and that was because I forgot to mark the exact length of my chest line. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use that pattern just to see what that length is instead of remeasuring it out. And then I'm going to connect my new waistline to my upper chest line. And now I'm grabbing my pattern master yet again, because the point of where your hip and your waist meet can be a little bit too sharp, and so I'm using the edge of my pattern master to kind of smooth out that area some. And now I'm marking my bust point again. Now, my bust point was already marked on my original pattern, so what you can do is you can use like an awl to kind of puncture a hole through your paper to mark where that point is. But for me, I find it's just easier for me to use my grading ruler to mark 4 inches from the center front edge inward. I did that for my bust line, my waistline, and also for my hip. Because I'm not drafting for the back, I don't really need to mark it on the chest line. Now, drafting the dart for this pattern is exactly the same as how you would draft it for a normal basic bodice block. You would come up on the hip by 2 inches, and then on your bust line, you'll come down by 1 inch. And that will give you the length of it. And then on your waistline, you would come out by a 1/2 inch on either side, and then you connect all those lines. Okay, so we finally got into the main point of this video. Now, I left a little portion of this next clip in because I just kind of wanted to show you guys a mistake that I made, which I end up re-recording later. But basically, whenever you're drafting darts, you don't want the dart to be directly at your bust point. You always want it to be shifted a bit. So you will see that the waist dart is shifted down by 1 inch. And the bust dart should be shifted to the side seam by 1 inch. But I drew mine so that my bust dart is shifted to the side by 1 inch, and down by 1 inch. So you will see that it's parallel to the top of my waist dart, versus it shouldn't be like that. So in a second, you're gonna see me go back and start with a new clean piece of paper, which I just drafted everything out already, and I'm now gonna fix it. Okay, so this is my out piece of paper. It was quite simple. Most of the work was already done, so I just retraced it out. Now I'm lining my ruler up to my chest line this time, and I'm coming out towards the side seam by 1 inch. And then I'm lining my ruler perpendicular to my bust line, and I'm coming down by 2 inches. Now, you don't want to actually measure this on your side seam. You want to measure it perpendicular to your bust line. So it might take a little bit of maneuvering your ruler in order to get the edge of your ruler at that 2 inch mark to intersect with your side seam, and that's what I did. Okay, so now the distance between our now dart legs is not the same as 2 inches. So because it's a diagonal line, it's like slightly off. Now, depending on how wide your dart is, it might be more of like a noticeable difference, but for mine's, it was only, the line ended up measuring to about 2 1/16 of an inch. And if you cut that in half, then the midpoint would be 1 inch, 1 1/32, however you would say that, of an inch. And so I pretty much just wrote down like the midpoint to be about 1 inch. And you will see that I'm actually extending my dart legs for the top, the middle, and the bottom out some, and that will be useful later. But for now, I'm just cutting out the neckline, the shoulder seam, and the armhole, and I'm making sure that I do not touch the side seam portion between the waistline and the chest line. You are going to need that paper later on for truing, so I would leave probably about like 3 inches just to be on the safe side, but it could probably be a little bit smaller than that. And because I don't need it, I am cutting off the hip portion right now. I would cut off more paper than what you need, simply because you are going to have to fold your paper into the shape of your dart, and the more paper you have on your pattern, it just makes it more difficult to actually fold your paper. So you will see that I'm actually going to go ahead and cut off some of the paper on my side seam just a little bit more, because it's just too big. Oh, never mind. Okay, so I'm gonna cut that paper off later on. I'm not doing it just yet. But folding your paper can be a little bit tricky. So what I'm actually using is my tracing wheel again, and I'm gonna trace on my dart legs. And that's just going to put little tiny punctures in the paper, and that's just going to kind of weaken it. It's almost like how you have something with a perforated line on it. It's always easier to fold in a straight line on something that's perforated, and so that's why I do it. So while you don't necessarily need a tracing wheel to trace your patterns, I would recommend having it simply for just darts alone. And if you're not familiar with truing a dart, it's actually quite simple. I remember when I first started hearing about truing darts, I always thought it was like the super daunting type of task, and I thought it was more technical, but it really isn't. It's just pretty much just folding your paper in the way that you would fold your dart, specifically on areas where the paper is, where that dart is sitting on like a diagonal line. So you wouldn't do it on something where, if you have like maybe like a half scale pattern where it's just like a bodice that ends at the waist, where that line hits is horizontal, and so you wouldn't need to true that dart. It would fold in a really like convenient way, but if you have a dart that sits on any type of seam that's diagonal, you'll find that when you fold it, one dart leg will be shorter and the other dart leg would be longer, and you would need a little bit of extra fabric to compensate for that. So now you'll see that I'm folding my paper, and I'm starting off by folding the center portion of my paper, well, at least the center of my dart, and then I'm continuing to fold all those other lines. And you want to make sure that when you fold your dart legs that you fold the excess. You'll have excess paper that's kind of hanging in the back somewhere. So instead of folding that paper just any old way, you want to make sure that it's folded down. It just works out better that way. And throughout this whole process, you want to be gentle with your paper. You don't want your paper to rip on you. So if it looks like I'm being overly cautious, it's because I am. And also, I forgot to mention, you are going to need some sort of tape, like masking tape. I would prefer a tape that's like made out of paper instead of plastic because it's just easier to rip. And I'm just able to use it with one hand if I need to. And so that is what I'm using. You really don't... Another reason why I would say that you should use like a paper type of tape is because I find that they're not very adhesive, and you want to be able to pull this tape back off of your pattern without it ripping your pattern. I'm pretty sure I'm using freezer tape right now. So the type of tape you use really just doesn't really matter as long as it's not too tacky. You want to be able to peel this tape back off of your paper easily. So you might want to test out different tapes to see which one works better. So now we're about to get to the fun part, but you guys can see right now that where that dart is, those lines are not matching, and that is the whole purpose as to why we need to true our darts. And you'll see my paper keeps moving on me, but at this point I am drawing a new side seam, and at this point actually you can use your scissors and you can cut along that new line, and when you cut that out, you will have your perfectly true dart. However, I decided to use my tracing wheel, and it's nice to use the tracing wheel instead, because if you find that the line wasn't drawn properly, you can open your pattern back up and you can redo it, which is helpful, versus if you just kind of cut it, it can cut out kind of wonky and you can't go back from there. Unless you, of course, tape on some new pattern paper. Okay, now we are all finished. So I actually measured it out, and I used a little bit more than about 1.5 inches of extra paper to true the dart. That's how much paper is kind of poking out from the sides. But just so that you guys can see that the front pattern will still fit your back pattern, what I'm doing is I'm retaping my dart, and then I'm going to place the front on top of the back, and then you'll see that everything still matches. And hold on, and there you have it. You see that with the dart folding, you can see that the patterns still match. So guys, if you enjoyed the video, please comment, like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on all my social media accounts. And if you have any video requests, you guys can leave me a message or comment down below, and hopefully I'll be able to get to that. And if you have any questions, you can also leave those in the comment section down below. Bye guys.